papers, particularly the Mail on Sunday and the I paper, but also write for the Guardian, the Times, the Wall Street Journal sometimes. And in the interests of full honesty, I should declare that I used to be speechwriter for David Cameron, and I also run a music project with Africa, bringing together African and Western artists, which has released various records and performed concerts in various parts of Africa and Europe. And I'm very glad to have with me Ed O, who is a documentary filmmaker with NBC News. And if you're eating any meat or tomatoes or anything like that, get that out of the way first, because he's going to show a documentary which is quite grueling about some of the stuff that he's seen recently in the Philippines. And Ed has been a journalist since he began as a student, a teenager, in a place like where he began reporting in Jerusalem and Jordan. And he covered the Arab Spring uprisings in 2011 for the New York Times. And he's covered a whole range of other stuff. But he just won an award for a film he made on the Philippines, which we're going to show you a short excerpt of to underline the human cost of the war on drugs. Also very pleased to have with us Paula Pellegrino, who's an associate researcher at Egrape Institute. Is that correct? Almost, okay. I'm not, being British, I'm not very good with languages. Where she focuses on drug policy, on penal executions, and on public and citizen security. And she holds a bachelor's degree in international relationship, and has also been a representative on the National Youth Council in Brazil, as well as writing sometimes for various papers. And Francisco Thoumi is a Colombian-American expert on drugs and crime. He's a senior member of the Colombian Academy of Economic Sciences and a corresponding member of the Spanish Royal Academy of Moral and Political Sciences. He also founded the Research and Monitoring Center on Drugs and Crime at a university in Bogota called Rosario University, and has worked with various UN programs, written books, and authored a mere 60 academic journals. So, welcome, and thank you very much for joining us. And I'm going to start by asking Ed to say a few words about the film he's going to show, and then you're going to have 10 minutes of a horror film from the Philippines.
Hi, my name is Ed O. I'm a filmmaker with NBC News Left Field. And last year I traveled to the Philippines with a fellow colleague of mine, Aurora Almendral. And we, every single night, we would do what they call the night shift, which is we would, can you guys hear me? Where we would follow the killings that happened with almost a shocking regularity every single night. I'm just gonna let you watch the film. Just a warning, this is about the war on drugs, and it is quite, it's quite graphic, so.
The Philippines President Duterte.
He's boasted and bragged about personally killing individuals, about clamping down on drugs, and they're widely believed by a variety of human rights groups to be extrajudicial killings taking place in the Philippines.
Trump praised him. He said he was doing an unbelievable job on the drug problem.
Ito yung natukhang. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Siguro kaya ginagawa ni Duterte yun para malinis ng Pilipinas. Pangit naman ang ginagawa niyang paglinis sa Pilipinas eh.
7, 8, 9.
Hitler massacred 3 million Jews. Now, there is 3 million drug addicts. I'd be happy to slaughter them.
Italy. Nais po namin pagbigay alam ng mahigpit na pinapatupad ng Sangguniang Barangay 133 ang mga sumusunod. Curfew for minors, mga menor de edad na nasa kalsada at iskinita nangyari na kayo ay nag-uwi na. Dapat po ang magsalit ng busyoke at mga pang-sistem ito ay hanggang alas 10 lamang ng gabi. Sa mga nakatambay na wala naman ginagawa sa labas ay maaari lamang po na kayo ay mag-uwi na. Ayan yung mga bata sa Arellano, nagkikita kayo namin dyan, nandiyan pa kayo sa lansangan. Pasensyahan po kayo kung kayo ay mahuli ng barangay Tanod ngayong gabi. Magdamit naman po kayo. Ito po ay concern lang po ang barangay 133 sa inyo. Maraming pong salamat. Magandang gabi.
Yung sa YouTube, yung tungkol din sa police.
Pinalo naman o. Yan po, police.
Pinalo yung sa civilian. Kasi po mga kabataan din yung nagiging biktima eh. Umiinom, nakaubad. Baka mangyari sa amin.
Ito no? Ito ba yun eh? Yan yun. Nabibidyon sila ako. Oo. Ano sa video ko? Ito pa yan. Itong yan si Bruce Lee natin. Patag. Ang lakas mo. Itong gino mo. Bruce Lee. Gago ka nawawa pa eh. Oo.
Parang normal na lang dun.
Tatlo?
Paulit-ulit na lang eh. Kahit sinasabi nila wala silang kasalanan pero
nag-isinta. Pero ito natulak, wala akong pakialam doon. Baka na sila tumihaya. Kung kayo ay mahirap ng loob, magsukong kayo. Ito ay nationwide autos ng ating Pangulo.
Para sa akin, yung ginagawa, yung sinabi ni Trump na okay yung drug on wars, siyempre masaya kami mga mga polis. Kasi gano'n mo dahil sa isang malaking bansa, sabihan tayo ng gano'n. Ginagawa namin war on drugs, meron kinahihirap na at talagang naayos namin lahat-lahat. Almost ready. Fire.
Para sa kalinisan ito, sa katahimikan ng ating mga barangay. Muli, sa ating bahan, mawalaman ng direktor ko mayroon ang ating sektor
pinupunta naman po namin sa mga bahay yung mga nasa drug watch list. Para po malaman lang kung ano yung halaga ng buhay at malaman nila kung paano nila gagawin. Tama yung ginagawa war on drugs ni Pangulong Duterte. Ayan yung mga tuloy-tuloy na deal ng drugs yan. Kaya sila napapatay dahil number 1, lumalaban sila sa kapulisan. Ito drugs. Ito drugs. Beautiful lady. Back drugs. Section 14. Yung iba drugs. Karamihan kasi dito drugs. Last one is drugs. No. Mas lumipis. Arrested. Mas lumipis siya. Detain, dead. Wala. Kasi iba na surrender na eh. Kaya lumipis na siya. Binibigyan namin lahat sila ng pagkakataon para mabuhay at para magtago. Pipiliin namin kung sino lang yung karapat-dapat. Ano meron dyan? Kasi kung di sila willing, mahirap kasi, lulukuhin lang kami. Marami na kaming na punta rito na niloko lang kami sobra-sobra. Walang ginawa kundi punta-punta lang dito, papakita-kita lang, yung pala nagbebenta pa rin siya. Si Ninyo, di ba patay na?
Opo.
Nagda-drug trade pa rin siya, nagbebenta pa rin kasi siya. Di ba sabi niya sa'yo niloloko lang tayo? Alam ko kasi yung nanloloko.
Pero natakot sila ko sa inyo. Nauna. Pero hindi na. Basta sasabihin lang sa inyo talaga yung nagpapaalam, pagka ganon.
Pero kung ikaw, tinuloy mo yan, malamang.
Hindi na, sir. Ayaw pa mamatay, sir. Kawawa, sir, sila. Tignan nyo, ako lang nag-asikas rito. Ako nagluluto. Wala namang mamamatay. Ako naglilinis at bahay. Magulo pa nga.
Wala namang mamamatay sa mga...
Ako nagluluto.
Tumutuwid na tayo. Nung una natakot siya. Kasi sabi ko sa kanya, pag di siya tumigil, bahala siya. Either makulong siya, mahuli. Depende. Depende naman. Hindi naman siya ganun katalamak. Kaya pa siyang baguhin.
Meron tayong flash report. Dalawang hinihinarang drug pusher. Patay! Sa enkwentro sa Paranaque. Huwag hinihinarang drug pusher. Yun yung sinasat ni Senior Superintendent Gemar Montesino, ang hepe ng Paranaque Police. Hindi na natin sa lugar. Nasabihan pa natin yung soko para ma-protest ito nandito na rin. Mukha ko ba? Ay, hindi ko masabi.
braso, sa?
Panipaniwala sa ulo tama eh.
Tama. Hindi na tinignan doon eh. Ikotin mo, siya likod, baka may exit.
Sabi na natin yun.
Entrance, exit.
Okay. Those are cuff marks. Also that. It's impossible that he fought back.
And the report will come out as he shot back because they found the gun.
Halika na kasama. Halika dito. Dati bang gumamit siya ng asawa mo?
Alam ko kung bakit yan, pero nakita ba nila sa CCTV camera kami ginagawa kalukuhan na sa akin ko? Lagi daw nakikita. Lagi lang. Bakit may ginawa pa? Tinatanong ko sila, may ginagawa pang kalukuhan na asawa ko? Wala silang may tanong, wala silang may ano.
Wala nga talaga tayong magagawa, nandiyan na yan. No?
Sa mga pamilya, simulat sa pool naman, alam nila yung trabaho ng kamag-anak nila, alam nila na nagtutulak. Bakit ngayong, kumbaga, huli na yung iniyakan nila. Hindi nila iniyakan nung nabubuhay pa, napatigilin nila. Alam naman nila yan.
Ayaw nila patigilin.
Ayaw nila patigilin. Pamilya sila, bakit parang kinukonsinti nila? So, okay na may nangyari na, tsaka mag-iiyakan. Kaya yung pulis, trabaho lang naman din yung ginagawa nila. Kaysa naman sila yung mamatay.
So I'm going to end this film here. The film does continue, so if you'd like to finish watching it, you can go on nbcleftfield.com, and it's on our website. I just want to say a few things. I know that was really hard to watch, but this, in the time that I was there, was happening every single night, 3-4 times a night. Every story that we saw would play out in different morgues in different places all across Manila. So I just want to, that's it.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that. I think in a way what you're seeing there in the Philippines is the most overt manifestation of the war on drugs. But in a way it's almost a natural conclusion to where this has been going. Here you have a populist leader who's using it to find a scapegoat like populist leaders do. And the scapegoat is to try and strengthen his position, his electoral position there. But of course this has been going on in other countries all around the world. It all goes back to, really in many ways, to President Nixon, who in June 1971 wanted to find a way to shore up his particular brand of uncompassionate conservatism. And so he pictured on the counterculture, which was so strong in America at the time, and he declared that drugs are the new public enemy #1. And that set the course for the sort of damage which we're seeing worldwide still today. We're seeing it in my country, we're probably seeing it in your country, we're certainly seeing it in countries like the Philippines, like Guinea-Bissau, like Guatemala, like Mexico, like Britain, like America. And the biggest beneficiaries, of course, which is perhaps not unsurprisingly given that the president who launched the war turned out to be a crook, have been the gangsters. They've been the gangsters who have profited from having a free market presented to them in which the most violent people get to control the market. It's hard to think of a stupider policy. Consider this one fact. Without the war on drugs, it's arguable that we wouldn't have had the war in Iraq and the rise of Islamic State. How come? President Bush won Florida by 537 votes, and yet we know that under the American penal system and the punitive approach to drugs, it disproportionately targets African Americans. In Florida, I think it's you're 4 times as likely to be sent to jail for a drug offense if you're black as if you're white. And then you get disenfranchised, and if you're in jail, you can't vote. So without those 537 votes, would Al Gore have won? If Al Gore had won, would they have launched the war in Iraq? If they hadn't launched the war in Iraq, would you have had de-Ba'athification? If you hadn't had de-Ba'athification, would you have had all the carnage that followed? Would you have had the resistance movement? And would you have had the rise of Islamic State? I would argue not. You might have, because you can never really have a counterfactual view of history. But it is arguable that without any of that, you might not have had even the rise of Islamic State. And remember, in 1998, people keep saying, just say no, don't take drugs, you shouldn't take drugs. but humans are humans. They've always taken drugs, and that's just a fact of life. The only question that should really matter is harm reduction. How do we reduce the harm? How do we protect people? How do we make sure that people don't harm themselves or harm other wider communities? In 1998, the United Nations told us that we would be drug-free in the year 2008. I don't think they hit that particular target. And yet, as an issue, it's been beyond the pale for many people. First time I wrote about it, I was asked to go and speak in the House of Commons in London. And at the end of it, the guy chairing it, I argued in favour of legalisation and regulation of all drugs. And the chair said, "So do you mean heroin as well?" And I said, "Well, yeah, obviously." And he said, "Okay, well, that's his view, that's not our view," and distanced himself very quickly from me. But it's also been ignored by by aid groups, by development industry, and until recently by human rights bodies, although it's hard to think of something which is more core to the human rights arguments. And that's why it's been very good at this particular conference to hear it. We had a superb presentation from Chico here about the Philippines and what's happening there. We heard also about how Venezuela has effectively become a narco state. And we've also heard from another guest here about how one of the byproducts is that you can't research drugs which are deemed illegal. So it's only now that people are really beginning to get to grips with medical marijuana and how the impact it can have on late-stage cancer, on childhood epilepsy, which for me is particularly emotional issue because my daughter has very profound epilepsy, and when I go and see how parents in other countries are allowed to take a drug that I'm denied, I find that very galling. But also we've heard about MDMA's usage in terms of trying to combat PTSD, yet these sorts of things are prohibited in many places by the fact that the drugs are illegal. And also you get a lot of the unintended consequences. So in Britain we've had, as they try and toughen things up, they've just eliminated a cutting agent for cocaine. So what has happened? Has that stopped cocaine? No. The price of cocaine has actually fallen and the potency has risen. So more people actually are dying of cocaine as a result of a government attempt to stop it. And again and again and again and again we see the same unintended consequences arising. We know from history, from those black and white gangster movies, if you have prohibition, what happens? Gangsters move in and they try to control the market and they develop stronger, easier to transport, higher profit narcotics. And we saw that with prohibition of alcohol, where it went from beer and wine to spirits and even people injecting themselves with alcohol. And we're seeing it again all around the world now. And it's particularly potent now because we have a globalized world and we have the rise of synthetic drugs. And so the systems for controlling drugs can't even stop it. So in British prisons now, spice is a massive problem, which is, it's called synthetic cannabis, but it's so far removed from the cannabis which most people know about. It's a really nasty, unpleasant drug. And if you can't stop it in prisons, how are you going to stop it anywhere else? Britain has 11,000 miles of coastline, and the total use of cocaine in our country would fit in one shipping container. We have 3,000 airports. How do you stop that? And yet, we can see there are alternative ways to do this. You look at somewhere like Portugal, where in 2001 they liberalised the system and they said, let's focus on harm reduction and decriminalisation. Let's not focus on criminalisation. And they now have cut heroin use from 100,000 people to 25,000 people. They have 1/10 of the rate of heroin use in my own country. They have 1/50th of the rate of opiates and heroin in the United States, which launched this. And the heroin death rate has gone down 2/3, while in Britain, which used to have a really good medical system of treatment, deaths have gone up 1/3. And we now have 1/3 of all deaths in Europe from drugs are in Britain. So that's a great way to deal with it. But also you see it in, had we changed the law, by the way, in Britain, we would save 40 lives a week. If you changed it in America, 1 life every 10 minutes would be saved if you had the same rate of death in America as you have in Portugal. Now, if that's not the most fundamental human right, the right to live, then what is? I was in Ohio, and talking to people there, you have fentanyl coming in, and you have carfentanil. Carfentanil is an elephant tranquilizer 10,000 times stronger than heroin. You take it 1 grain, 2 grains, but if you mix it up wrong, people are dying. People are dying in huge numbers. When I was there, 3 nurses were taken sick and had to be given Narcan to stop them overdosing because they were treating a patient. So strong is this drug. dealers are dying because they're cutting it up. This is the reality of a globalized world in which drugs can be made, in this case often in Asia, and shipped and kept through customs and sold wherever they want. And I went to the coroner's court in Ohio, and he has guys looking at the dark web, and they're seeing which drugs are being made, and they know that within 5 months they'll be killing people in Midwest America, in Dayton, Ohio. And even while I was there, someone died from a drug that they'd seen 5 months previous made, a new drug. It's undetectable, it's unstoppable. So it's all about trying to find ways to stop the use of it. It's about harm reduction. And you think about human rights, it's the human right to live. It's also the human right to go to school. There's a guy here I was talking to from Guatemala who told me that when the kids go to school in Guatemala, there's so much gangsterism that they have a car following the school bus which has 4 armed guards in it. Just imagine that, if you live in a secure European or North American environment, that you've got to have armed guards to take the kids to school. And then, of course, we all know about what's happening in places like the Philippines. We've seen in places like Mexico, where the death rate has gone through the roof. But what's really good is change is starting to happen. The futility, the stupidity of this policy, this deadly policy, which is killing tens of thousands of people around the world through gangsterism, through drug use, it's wrecking communities. It is beginning to change. We've seen it from the Czech Republic to Norway recently. Where we are now has, as I understand it, decided to decriminalise drugs and following the Portuguese model of harm reduction. We're seeing it from Jamaica, from Canada, from Uruguay to the United States. Change is coming. No one says that drugs are good things. We're just saying that people use them. People drink, they smoke, they take drugs. They have done through all humankind. They've taken them from the dawn of time. And the key is to have harm reduction, to protect people, to protect children, to protect communities, to protect countries. I go to Mali a lot because of the music. And in Mali there, one of the reasons for the coup was that the government, the social setup had been corroded because new transportation routes were coming in and using the old desert smuggling routes to get cocaine from South America to Europe. And it was a weak government and there was corruption and it helped corrode it. There are other reasons, of course, for the war in Mali and what happened, but the rise of Islamism was partly, again, due to that. We're recognizing slowly, however, that addiction is a disease, it's not a crime. And yet the really odd thing to me about all this is when you think that it was a conservative president launched it, and it tends to be conservatives around the world who are still fighting this war, is that drug reform is actually a very, very, very conservative cause. It's tough on crime, it cuts public spending, it cuts waste, it protects children, it safeguards families, it safeguards poorer communities, and it aids global security. It's hard to think of a more sensible policy, so it's good that it is changing, but we still have a long way to go. And never forget that it is an absolutely core human rights battle, this fight, to have a focus on harm reduction rather than on death and disaster and devastation. So thank you, and I'm now going to ask Anna to speak.
Thank you, Ian. So just while Ed puts on quickly the slides here, just to present myself, I'm Ana Paula. I'm a researcher in Brazil, which is in Latin America. And again, very touched particularly by the war on drugs and by how different drug policies have been affecting my region. I wanted to, if you can pass to the next one. I wanted to start, and the next one. This is a nice quote by Kofi Annan, but we'll go straight to the point. So I wanted to start by bringing back Ian's point about how drug policy, it sort of doesn't look at history. 5,000 years ago, the Chinese and other civilizations, they already used drugs. It's an intrinsic human behavior. Ever since, humans have experimented with mind-altering substances in therapeutic, medical, and religious settings. And also because they just wanted to get high. I mean, it tends to be fun from time to time, and it's normal for humans to experiment. Yet, in 1961, a complex is actually Mare, where 3 drug gangs, militia, and police fight daily actually, over control for territory in the drug market. All odds were against her. Last year in Rio de Janeiro, schools had to shut down for 135 of the 200 days of the school year due to gunfire and shooting. Kids were instructed to lay down on the ground, while police and drug gangs faced off outside. In whichever order, gang versus gang, police versus gang, gang versus police, militia versus gang. Marielle grew up like this. And how do you learn anything under gunfire? Yet she went against all odds when she decided to study, got into university, and later went on to become an advisor to a popular state representative. She soared high as the coordinator of Rio de Janeiro's Legislative House of Human Rights Commission. Through her work as a human rights defender, she supported families of victims of police violence, which she investigated and condemned in the commission. She spoke out about the lack of state action to prevent the use of deadly force by police. Her outrage over the loss of young life was clear in her actions, as she lamented police officers being acquitted on charges of self-defense while they killed teenagers who were going home after running errands for parents, whom police referred to as drug dealers in court, in a clear strategy to demoralize the victim in the eyes of the jury, as if this could justify their shots at point-blank range. 15% of Rio's 6.7 thousand homicides, that's the amount of homicides we had last year, are police killings. That amount of homicides translates to a rate of 40 violent deaths per 100,000 inhabitants. Norway's, by comparison, is 0.5 per 100,000, so it's 80 times bigger. She also supported the families of police officers who were killed, most of them while off duty. There are over 130 such cases of police being killed last year in my town. These highly underpaid and underprepared policemen and women react to robberies even when not in badge and uniform, because, among other things, they're afraid that if a burglar catches even a whiff of the fact that they're a cop, they will be executed. Yet they end up dead regardless. And if a cop loses his life while on duty, well, then Marielle knew that her phone would soon ring. A civilian in a community where a cop dies is 1,150% more likely to be killed by police on the same day, 350% on the following day, and 135% more likely of being killed by police in the coming 5 to 7 days after a police killing when compared to normality, which is also having police killings happening in your community. And this closes a full circle. Marielle, she stood up for all these victims and their families as well. She flew even higher in a brilliant campaign, and after taking office, working with LGBTI rights, women's issues, and continued her work to promote a safer community for all. But she was brutally murdered 2 months ago, 2 months and a half ago actually, with 4 9mm bullets shot in her head. Anderson, her driver, was also killed in the attack. Investigators suspect militia and militia-related politicians were involved in the execution. These groups, the militia, they were initially formed in town around military police officers that got together to expel drug gangs from communities, and these groups gained legitimacy. They were seen as a lesser evil of sorts. But later they started extorting slum dwellers and small business owners. They installed their own violent rule over territory and even ran their own drug trade, because why not? It's very lucrative. One of the suspected masterminds behind this atrocity was a fellow councilman of Marielle and sits on the city council as we speak. Drug policy has affected this woman's life and her death. The costs to her directly are enormous. The costs to the city of Rio de Janeiro and to our community are uncountable. The cost to democracy, since she was an elected official, and in Latin America and all across the globe, are unthinkable. Unfortunately, there are many Marielles, victims to the violence of this drug policy, and I repeat this, drug policy, and not drug-fueled war. Fortunately, there are also many other Marielles, young men and women willing to raise their voices and state how unacceptable things are in the current state of affairs. The price of keeping me, a white upper-middle-class kid who never missed a day of school in life because bullets crisscrossed the skies, safe from drugs, was Marielle's execution. Women incarcerated all over Latin America for transporting small amounts of drugs as drug mules should also be counted here. Men who are taken into prison on petty drug charges and find themselves coerced into drug gangs too. Drug users who are denied harm reduction, substitution treatment, and other non-abstinence-based interventions and end up dying of complications
due to preventable AIDS or hepatitis contamination, or completely preventable overdoses. And also those who are forced into involuntary treatment pay this price as well. People who have no access to pain medications like morphine and who suffer unnecessarily because medical marijuana is not legal in their countries, they're also in this bill. How many more need to die before we end this insane war? This was something Marielle asked. And today I hope that you take this question home. You make this question to yourselves, to your friends, to your acquaintances, to your elected officials, and to everyone. Together we can move to free our communities from this drug-free mindset that inflicts so much pain and justifies all this violence. We already know what needs to be done. You need to end criminalization of drug use. It's not supposed to be treated as a crime. If it is an abuse and if there is need for intervention, it's public health. We should invest in alternative punishment for low-level drug offenders and support sustainable socioeconomic development options for youth in cities who are involved in drug gangs and in the countryside who currently are engaged in the supply market. We need to reorient policing strategies. Again, as Ian was saying, this is a very conservative agenda as well. So that they focus on dismantling and actually being efficient in their strategies to dismantle the higher levels of organized crime, targeting their financial links to legal institutions. Grant access, and we should grant access and invest in medical and scientific research with all drugs. Finally, we should move forward with responsible drug regulation, and I'll ask you to just go forward 2 slides. Drug regulation, when it's responsible, when it's tailored policy, not to the will of morality, but to the levels of individual and social risk that each substance present, has lower risks for, it has lower costs for society. Whenever we have unregulated criminal market or all the way unregulated legal market, the costs individually and socially are very high. But if we can stay, and I'm sorry because I'm sort of in the front here, but if we can stay in this hashed area between decriminalization and harm reduction, responsible legal regulation, and light regulation for all substances, each one having a response tailored to the amount of risk and to the amount of harm that it can cause to individuals and to our societies, that is the way forward. We need to take control. Drug policy reform, it's not a silver bullet. It will not solve all problems, nor should it be approached lightly. But it provides us with an opportunity to untie this Gordian knot that we've created in our heads and rationalize a debate so that police can focus on violence reduction, health and other welfare system-related personnel can focus on prevention, harm reduction, and treatment, and users, if they don't incur problems, can be free to make responsible choices over how they want to experience life. Only then we will be able to build policies that actually promote health and safety for all, be it here in Norway, as Norway moves forward in decriminalization, be it in Portugal, be it in Brazil, be it in the Philippines, all around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna, for that fantastic insight coming from Brazil with what you're seeing there and responding to that. That was fantastic. Francisco now is going to talk a bit about the sort of multilateral issues involved in the struggle to change and reform.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm a member of the International Narcotics Control Board. The board is an independent board made of 13 people, all of them elected by the Economic and Social Council, including the UN. 10 positions come from candidates presented by, nominated by governments, and 3 are candidates nominated by the WHO, the World Health Organization. The board has had the reputation of being the more closed, secretive, and conservative agency of the UN. must start saying that I'm speaking as myself. I'm sure that many of my colleagues on the board would not agree with everything I say here, so I came here as a person. Now, the board is some sort of, well, it's a quasi-judicial organ of the conventions. And by quasi-judicial organ, some like to think that this is some sort of Supreme Court in the world about drug policies. So, since we are an organ of the conventions, one has to start with the conventions. And basically, the conventions determine that the only use for all the drugs that are controlled, of course, the two main drugs domesticated in the West, and that the ones that really cause most of the deaths, I mean, alcohol and tobacco, they are not part of that. But the purpose, basically, of the system is to limit the use to medical and scientific purposes. The origin of that, I can trace, of course, you said there have been attempts in China a long time ago, but the real origins of the system lie on the positions taken by some American missionaries in China after the Opium Wars in the middle of the 19th century. The point is that even though in the preface of the convention it says, desired to conclude a generally acceptable international convention, blah, 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 limiting such drugs to medical and scientific use. That's the purpose of the conventions. And then the next sentence is that from a point of view of public policy today sounds extremely naive. The parties shall take such legislative and administrative measures as may be necessary, blah, blah, to limit exclusively to medical and scientific purposes the production, manufacture, export, import, distribution of, trade in, use and possession of drugs. So this is something that has been imposed without any discussion of whether policies are effective, or what are the costs of the policies, what are the benefits of the policies. The penal provisions are equally broad. Each party shall adopt such measures as will ensure that cultivation, production, manufacture, extraction, preparation, possession, offering for sale, distribution, purchase. I run out of breath on all this. Purchase, sale, delivery of any terms whatsoever in transit, transport, import, blah, blah, blah. They should, that is, and beside that, they add, and any other than in the opinion of the party, that is the government, may be contrary to the provision of this convention, shall be punishable offenses when committed intentionally, and that serious offenses shall be liable to adequate punishment, particularly by imprisonment and other penalties. Blah. So basically, this was a very law enforcement punitive system by definition, from the beginning. The conventions obviously do not differentiate between different drugs. Every drug, marijuana, fentanyl, which is extremely dangerous today, or cocaine, whatever, everything is the same. The conventions also does not differentiate between experimental, occasional, frequent, addict, non-medical drug users. And everybody who uses is defined as an abuser. So implicitly, the goal of the convention is a world without drugs. Now, however, the convention does allow for lax treatment of users. I mean, they are criminals because obviously they're breaking the law, but they don't have to be penalized. That's sort of the only concession that it has. Now, the conventions, I mean, basically what the conventions have done is that they give a group of people at the board, mostly they have been penal lawyers, diplomats, some psychiatrists, toxicologists, pharmacists, and so on. Basically a monopoly to decide how to implement policies, that is, how to interpret the convention. So what I've argued is that this is an attempt to depoliticize psychoactive drug policy. Especially, and this is, across the world. And as a result of that, this type of policy is very welcome in many authoritarian regimes. They don't complain about it. But it is in liberal societies and open societies in which there are really social costs, or at least perceived social costs. I mean, in authoritarian regimes, I mean, we saw that they are proud of killing people. But when we have liberal societies, this is simply, it generates a lot of social backlash and reaction, and this is what we are seeing now in the world. Now, the board is a subsidiary body of the UN. We are not members of the board of the UN, and we are not paid. We have a staff that it is. Because of that, for a long time, the board's position on human rights was based on the fact that they did not apply to drug policies. Because the argument was, first, we are not part of the UN, we are an organ of the convention. If the UN disappears, the convention continues because that's a treaty. And there is nothing in the convention, there's no mandate in the convention that we have to take human rights into consideration. Originally in the convention, the idea was to have the board as a monitor or a watchdog of the compliance of countries with the conventions. But the way it was implemented, it was interpreted, the board became, and actually became extremely proud of being the guardians of the conventions and trying to promote more and more prohibitionists. This is why many people have referred in the past to the board as the Inquisition. Okay. Now, I got to the board because when President Santos decided to start to talk about the fact that you have to rethink drug policies, I published an open letter in the Colombian press. He called me, I was simply telling him, look, with the United States, you go and you can negotiate how much more aerial spraying they are going to pay for. Okay? But if you are going to discuss policies, you better go to the UN. Then when there was a vacancy at the board, I sent him another note and said, okay, if you are serious about your thinking, please send me to the board. I will nominate you. I had to go and go through the election process and so on. So I was elected. As I arrived, I was perceived as a Trojan horse. Okay. And, in one conference in Ecuador, a former Colombian president introduced me as the masochist who's at the IDB, at the INCB. He's the masochist there, okay? The second day I was there, I was informed that I have wasted my life. I'm an economist and I'm in social sciences. Social sciences are not sciences. No, no, no. The only sciences are medicine, physics, biology, natural sciences. What you have, Mr. Thoumi, you are a speculator. You have absolutely not knowledge about it. So that's where we started. However, through time, I've been there for 6 years, there were a couple other members, new members, that have changed, and the world has changed, and we have been pushing for change. So I want to read now from our last annual report. The board continues to emphasize that for drug control action to be sustainable, it must be consistent with international human rights standards. Okay. The board stresses the importance of protecting the rights of persons with mental health, illness, and improving mental health. The board also highlights the need to protect children from drug abuse and prevent the use of children in the illicit production and trafficking of illicit substances. The board stresses the need to protect the rights of drug offenders and drug users at all stages of the criminal justice process. Under the international drug treaties, states are required to be proportionate in their responses to drug-related offenses and their treatment of suspected offenses and their treatment of drug offenders. Extrajudicial responses to drug-related criminality are in clear violations of the International Drug Control Conventions, which require that drug-related crime be addressed through formal criminal justice responses, as well as of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which require adherence to internationally recognized due process standards. Although the determination of some...
Will you just wrap up in a sec, just to get some questions, because of them overrunning earlier?
Well, let me just finish this. So, 2 minutes. Although the determination of sanctions is prerogative of the state, the board continues to encourage the state that retain the death penalty for drug-related offenses to commute death sentences that have been handed down and to consider the abolition of the death penalty. I'm proud to be persona non grata in the Philippines. Last month, at the last session of the board, three of us, I had started many years back, several years back, advocating bringing in all the stakeholders to the board. Last month, for the first time, we had as an experiment that the first morning of the session of the board was devoted to listen to civil society. We had 10 NGOs from all, extreme prohibitionists to libertarian on the other side, to come and talk to the board. in the board there was a fear that to establish a dialogue, so we didn't respond. Okay, but we survived, and I think that the next time we'll try to have a dialogue. Then, the next step, this is something I'm pushing for, is that we have to bring other stakeholders. We have to bring to the session of the board groups of drug users, association representative of drug users, and representatives of coca grower associations and poppy grower associations. So the effort has been to open up the board. It's been, Ana Paula says it's too little, so on. It's the best I can, I've been able to do. I cannot claim that I'm the only one in this. When I arrived, I was 1 versus 12 in many ways. But I'm very proud of the changes that we have accomplished. I have a lot more to talk, but obviously I cannot. But the only thing that I can say that after all this might be a little bit of a positive note, that at least at the international level, we are trying to open up so that we can think about the complexity, the real complexity of drug policies, and about that picture that you had here, because basically both total free markets and absolute prohibition had very, very simple ideas, and very simple ideas always are false solutions to complex problems. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and apologies for having to speed you on, but I know the clock is ticking. Just very quickly, does anyone want to contribute or ask any questions here? Anyone? No?
Yeah, I just wonder why you said earlier, nobody says drugs are good, it's all about harm reduction. Because what we've heard is the treaties say all use is abuse. And so I think it's a powerful argument to be able to say that most users get benefits. And so I think you're kind of conceding too much when you say that like you did.
Okay, fair point. I take that on board. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I'm not standing here as someone who's advocating that everyone should take drugs. What I'm standing here is saying that I'm looking at harm reduction, and that in anything, motor vehicles can be very harmful things and can cause a lot of damage and do cause a lot of carnage, which is why there needs to be regulation of motor vehicles. And to me, drugs are like the same sort of thing, that they can be something which is quite liberating for people. They can be something which change how we interact as a society. But equally, there needs to be very strong control of it to ensure that you don't have a sort of free-for-all, in which case there'd be crashes, left, right, and centre. So I guess that was what I was trying to say, and quite happy to be picked up.
Okay, and I'll say most drug policy analysis doesn't include benefit enhancement, which would change how we look at things a lot. So I think harm reduction for sure and benefit enhancement together is a way you do rational policy analysis.
I guess I used to make a very liberal argument, just the libertarian argument, but I'm increasingly influenced by the fact of what's going to win the case. And in America, you notice the case, the change is, from what I could see, it seemed to change in terms of the debate from when it stopped being basically hippies in California and became the soccer mums who were interested in safety. So that's, I guess, where I'm coming from. But I'm quite happy to be picked up on that point. Do you want to add anything with your sort of expertise from what you've seen on the ground in the Philippines? I mean, when you see what's happening in the world.
Well, all I want to say is first I want to thank all the members of the panel for shedding light on both to highlight, to document the human rights violations and speak truth to power. Tell our governments, tell our states that this is not working. You said it, Ana Paula, 60 years, 50 years of drug policy that has created so much suffering around the world, not just in my country. What's happening in my country, the Philippines, is just a new manifestation of something that has been going on in many other parts of the world. In the story you mentioned about the daily violence in Rio and in Sao Paulo and the other big cities, tell us that this is not sustainable. We need to press on, make it a human rights issue, and pursue all we can in all areas of work, research, advocacy, but ultimately hold our states and our leaders to account for the damage that's happening on a daily basis. That's all I want to say.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we need to wrap up, I'm afraid, so we're having to truncate slightly, but I think that's the key message, which I think all of us would want to share, and that it is a human rights thing, and that we shouldn't be shy of speaking truth to power and pointing out that at the moment these are policies which are doing so much harm, whether it's on sort of micro level in terms of, it's amazing to hear that one school in Rio, 135 out of 200 days, the kids couldn't go to school because of gun fire. You know, it's a sort of small symbol of a much wider problem. So can I thank all the panelists for brilliant contributions and for enlightening us in this way, and thank you for joining us, and hope you enjoy the last afternoon.